Antoine is reader in international relations at Birkbeck College, University of London. His work lies at the intersection of war and political violence, the history and philosophy of science and technology, and social and political theory in the digital age. He is the author of The Eye of War, Military Perceptions from the Telescope to the Drone, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2018, and which won the 2019 Book Prize from the Science, Technology, and Art and International Relations section of the ISA. And if anyone's interested, there are flyers at the back for a conference discount. He's also the author of The Scientific Way of Warfare, Order and Chaos on the Battlefield of Modernity. And I'll let you see the title of the talk.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks to Beryl and to the organizers for putting together this fantastic conference and for inviting me to give you this talk. What I want to do, today I'm going to talk, give you a talk based to some extent on my recent book published at Minnesota Press, The Eye of War. And I won't give you the full kind of rundown of the argument. I want to do something more focused to the needs of the conference today. But just briefly to let you to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, the purpose of the book was really to interrogate or to construct the genealogy of our contemporary times, which I would qualify as ones of global targeting, where increasingly whatever can be perceived anywhere on the surface of the planet can be targeted. And in order to understand this, I tried to break down, analyze what Paul Virilio called the logistics of perception, in order to distinguish three distinct functional elements of sensing, imaging, and mapping, understanding their interpenetration, their development since the early modern period to where we are now. Now, what I want to do in this talk, however, is focus, to begin with, on the foundational moment or the foundational role of the cardinal moment in Western art, that was linear perspective. And in my narrative as well, I think it is the crucible of what I referred to as a martial gaze. So I want to run through that, explain this fundamental role of perspective and how we still live in some ways the legacy of that perspectival moment. In the second movement, I want to examine the recent turn to the idea of scopic regimes. That's something we've seen deployed to talk about analysis of drones and military perception more generally. A model or a theory that came from cultural theory, from the work of Martin Jay in the first instance, which attaches a great importance to perspective as well, and in that respect I share much with that perspective. But I think there's some important differences in the conception of the martial gaze that I advance, and I think it has significant implications for practices of counterconduct, including artistic. And so this is not so much a critique of scopic regimes as, in a sense, an important kind of rejoinder and supplement. And hopefully that can help clarify a number of pertinent issues. So, moving on to this perspectival moment. It's very difficult actually to overstate the importance of the advent of perspective in the history of the Western world, and more widely perhaps in the world in toto. We think of it, of course, as the archetypal movement of Western art, with the development of a sense of depth perception, the construction of elaborate images, a rupture, if you want, in the history of artistic representation that has had many kind of ideological, cultural ramifications. A departure from the visual practices of the Middle Ages, the depictions of realistic or very similar space, attached to a kind of humanistic understanding of the world presented to the human subject as opposed to the world represented in a numinous religious fashion. So these are kind of well-rehearsed arguments. But I want to go further than that and say that one of the very important things about linear perspective is that it's not merely an artistic movement. In fact, it is an articulation of artistic representation, contemporaneous optical science, techniques of surveying, and cartographic practices. And it's important to understand that profound articulation, because that particular moment in the Renaissance, of course, art and science are not understood as distinct practices, but very much as unitary practices. The idea of the two cultures, or anything that we're very familiar with in the 20th century, is antithetical to the Renaissance mindset. And so what I'm particularly interested in the context of perspective is understanding linear perspective as a process of conjoined rationalization of vision and mathematization of space. So there's an important dual movement going on here, where there's a hitching of vision to space, so that mathematical space can be represented to the eye, and the constructions from there can also effectively measurements, captures of spatial reality. So in sum, linear perspective could be seen as constituted by three, or is a technique for three activities. Measurement by eye. This rests on the principles of optical science developed in this period. Techniques of surveying, using triangulation through visual surveying, rest on this, on the application of geometric knowledge of trigonometry effectively, in order to be able to measure space, to capture it from a visual perspective. Secondly, it involves the rule-governed construction of optically convincing images. Perspective is a rigorous way of producing images. You have to follow the rules of construction of perspective. You have to effectively either understand the geometry, or at least know how to practice the geometry through various shortcuts or technical aids, in order to produce images that will look visually realistic, if, and in fact only so long as you stand in one particular position. The image is constructed from a very distinct, unique position of the viewer. You have to be in front of the vanishing point, effectively, at least in a one-point perspective image, to get the full illusion. And thirdly, perspectives involves the geometric projection of a three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional surface in a manner that preserves the relative proportions of that space, which is why you can, through the inverse laws of perspective, extract from a perspectival images the relative sizes and positions of objects within that space. So this is why the perspectival image is effectively a measurement of a space. Maybe that space is fictitious, maybe that space has never existed, maybe that space is very real. But either way, it captures this in an important fashion. And all of this will have very significant consequences as we advance. Now this chimes with what Martin Jay calls in his famous text, The Scopic Regimes of Modernity, what he refers to as Cartesian perspectivalism. What Antonio Somani summarized as the reduction of perceptual space to mathematical and homogeneous space, with an understanding of vision as monocular, static, fixed and immediate, distant and objectifying, purely theoretic and disincarnated. And I'd go along with that. Jay himself insists on the conception of space that emerges through perspective, which is a geometrically isotropic, rectilinear, abstract and uniform conception of space. People have already noted in many ways that the spatial conception that's expressed through linear perspectives becomes the spatial conception of emerging modern science, which conceptualizes space in this abstract, empty fashion, certainly under the Newtonian understanding of space. So art in this particular time plays a very critical role in advancing or in participating, there's obviously a complex set of feedback relations here, advancing a certain understanding of the cosmos, of the world, and of perception itself, which now increasingly can be understood through a set of rational mathematical processes and abstracted, disembodied in some ways from immediate phenomenological experience, because it's abstractable, because it's replicable and theorizable. Lev Manovich has argued that these specific techniques are the inception of, participate in the inception of a now much wider visual nominalism that uses vision to capture the identity of individual objects and spaces by recording distances and shapes so as to create detailed maps of three-dimensional reality. So this is to say that we live in an age where visual nominalism is much more widespread. There are lots of techniques for the capture of space and for its representation that don't pass directly through linear perspective. think of radar or laser, which effectively exploit what we know about the movement of electromagnetic waves in order to make measurements. But these are really an extension of that goal, of that technique of linear perspective in the first place. And on the right side, we have an image from Robert Flood's book where he demonstrates quite clearly how using what was called a velo, a grid, you can reconstruct images through techniques of surveying, effectively through perspectival methods. Now, as I explained to you already, these images are crucially rule-governed in their construction. And this has a very important implication, which is, from the outset, they lent themselves to a progressive process, to a process of mechanization and progressive automation. Here we have a engraving from Albrecht Dürer on the instruction of measurement, and he's demonstrating one of many different instruments that were developed in order to automate the production of perspectival images. In this one, you use a piece of string that lines from a particular place on the object to a position on the wall, which would be the position of the eye, and you, through a frame, measure the position of that ray of light, visual ray, if you want, and you mark this on a canvas. You take multiple measurements, and over time you have a perspectival image. So from the very beginning, because the construction of perspectival images was a mathematical exercise, and many artists don't really want to be dealing with geometry or want to find shortcuts to producing their images, there was a concerted attempt to develop aids to help with the construction of perspectival images that might dispense the artist from having to understand necessarily all the geometry. And this, I think, we have to understand actually as the beginning of a long historical process for the automation of the construction of perspectival images. A development that, of course, concludes, or at least reaches a culmination in the advent of photography. In fact, photography had already in many ways rested on techniques that had already abstracted or automated the process of perspectival images, such as the camera lucida or the camera obscura, which effectively used lenses to create images. The problem for a long time was how to fix those images. And it's only in the mid-19th century that the photochemical process is developed that allows the fixation of images. It's important to understand the camera as part of that lineage, as part of an effort to produce perspectival images in an automated fashion. Now, again, this production of automated images doesn't only serve an artistic or documentary function, but it is also, again, a system for measurement, or at least potentially one. This leads to the technique of photogrammetry. It's important to understand, again, this is from the very beginning, when photography is invented, when photography is unveiled to the French Parliament. Its advocates already explain that one of the things we're going to be able to do is make measurements through photographs. They understand that from the outset. It's not a subsequent discovery. Here we have a record of one of the early experiments in photogrammetry by the French engineer, military engineer, Aimé Locédar, who attempted to extract or to produce a map of a small village by taking photographs around it, triangulating them, and in order to, again, extract the information out of them. Now, the theory of photogrammetry was pretty airtight, but the practice turned out to be a lot more complicated, because it is actually quite complicated to extract reliable information out of images, because there's all sorts of conflicting optical illusions that can be created by the images. You have to be able to distinguish points. It turns out to be a lot more complicated than perhaps its advocates thought, and so the development of photogrammetry was quite slow, but really acquired a new kind of intensity with the advent of the First World War. And throughout the First World War, the Second World War, and thereafter in the Cold War, aerial surveillance becomes critical. So it's the combination of the camera with the aircraft that really brings photogrammetry into maturity, and certainly into a critical military technology. Because from that position of horizontal elevation, you can, of course, survey the battlefield, you can obtain various measurements from it, you can get the necessary means, effectively, to produce a cartography, You could do it manually by assembling photographs together, or you can, again, extract distances or positions on the photograph in order to register them on a more conventionally produced map. In the context of the Cold War, of course, aircraft then give way to remote satellites, and photogrammetry is again a very important field or activity of satellite sensing. Here again, to be understood in a much wider visual nominalism, most of remote sensing is not perspectival sensing. It's IR, infrared sensing, and radar, and so on. But again, it operates within the same impulse. One of the other critical, of course, developments, which we can trace again back to this automation of perspective and to the measurements embedded in perspectival images, is the digitization, or rather the development of machine vision, which passes through digitization. So the digitization of imaging, the creation or the shift from the photochemical capture of light to the registering of electromagnetic intensities into statistical aggregates, produces images that are much more amenable to algorithmic processing. And so we've progressively developed machines that can look at images at, again, statistical arrays of intensities of light and make determinations, try to interpret the content of these images, recognize shapes, patterns within them. And of course, this all feeds into things that we're very much mindful of today in terms of the automation or autonomization of perception as it particularly pertains to weapon systems. And quite clearly, the autonomization of perception, I think, has to be understood as the ultimate culmination of the process of visual rationalization set in motion in the Quattrocento, whereby the process of perception has been sufficiently abstracted, automated, or rule-governed, that effectively it can be disembedded completely from the human subject. Now, the drone phenomenon, now to move on to the second part of what I want to talk about, the drone phenomenon of the past decade, and I think it's important to note that the drone phenomenon is as much a development in war as an intense focus of academic attention, and at times I think we've perhaps been guilty with focusing on a drone too much to the extent of much wider questions of military perception. I think it's very important to understand the drone as merely a lateral or particular development of much longer term trends and not to get fixated on the object itself. But in any case, what has come to the fore is this notion of scopic regimes. That a number of scholars have turned to this notion as a way to apprehend these visual practices. So among them, of course, Derek Gregory, who's present with us here, who in 2011, and I think Derek's probably the first to make this use of scopic regimes in the military context, certainly in the one of drones. We have here a series of definitions of what military scopic regimes would be, because originally the theory of scopic regimes was not concerned with the military problem. So Derek Gregory tells us that it's a mode of visual apprehension of a militarized regime of hypervisibility. Martin Coward proposes that it's a grid of intelligibility through which militaries envision the battle space. And Carl Grayson defines it as a visual practice that operationalizes the kill chain. So the very strong sense that if we want to understand the processes of targeting, of military power in the 21st century, we have to deal with a very specific kind of modality of vision. But then what is this fundamental understanding of scopic regimes that underpins their application here? I think the most sustained attempt to define and to understand this can be found in a recent paper by Carl Grayson and Jocelyn Maudsley, Scopic Regimes and the Visual Turn in International Relations. So in an attempt to understand it in a much broader sense, but again, through the drone as the main case study, main empirical treatment here. And I'm going to try and use this article as a bit of a foil, not because I think it's a bad article, not at all. It's a very good article. I recommend that you read it, because I think it is, again, the most sustained attempt to apply scopic regimes. But because of that, I think it allows most clearly the points of difference, perhaps, that I want to articulate. Grayson and Maudsley are concerned in particular, as they put it, with how particular fields of vision are constructed, such that representational properties are perceived as truthful. So from their perspective, visuality is being apprehended largely, as they put it themselves, as a discursive practice or a rhetorical exercise. I think in a similar way, Derek Gregory defined scopic regimes as a mode of visual apprehension that is culturally constructed and prescriptive, socially structured and shared. And so the distinction I want to make, the difference I want to make between this use of scopic regimes and what I've called the martial gaze is the distinction between a more culturalist and constructionist understanding of visuality and an approach that I think is more attentive to the functionalism and pragmatics of perceptual regimes. And this theoretical distinction, I think, has important implications at the level of theory and countervailing praxis. So Grayson and Maudsley, in particular, in their effort to ground scopic regimes for their purposes, go back to the original conceptualization of scopic regimes in the work of Martin Jay, again, Scopic Regimes of Modernity from 1988. And so it's important that we return to this source to understand precisely where this discursivist construction comes from. So as I've already mentioned, this notion by Martin Jay begins with an outline of the central scopic regime, the primary scopic regime of modernity, which is Cartesian perspectivalism. Again, here, no big differences. I think the description that's given here is one I would concur with, is one that's, I think, largely concurrent with a lot of work that's been done over the years. There's an extensive treatment, certainly within art history, of perspectivalism and its various effects. So what is perhaps more significant or more important for our purposes here is the manner in which Jay identifies what he calls alternative scopic regimes, which he sees as having resisted or subverted in various ways Cartesian perspectivalism. And Jay identifies two of these in his article. The first is Dutch 17th century painting. Draws on the work of Alpers here, and he makes the claim that this painting was, although in some ways sharing, of course, some kind of conventions of perspectivalism, was more interested or more invested in the art of describing, much more interested in privileging surfaces rather than objects and spaces, foregrounding textures over forms. And indeed, for that reason, the perspectivalism of these images is often quite approximate. It's not looking for the precision and fidelity of the original Renaissance art. So, interestingly, Jay makes a connection between this and Baconian empiricism. So he thinks that actually this model of painting is also tied into a certain scientific conception, one that's less tied to the rationalism of the early scientific movement, and more in a kind of more sensuous Baconian empiricism. Jay, interestingly, aligns this what he calls an anti-perspectival scopic regime with the later development of photography. So in his mind, the photography is also part of this art of describing because it captures everything in an indiscriminate fashion and so on. Now, this claim is actually one of the places where I start seeing kind of issues that I want to engage with, because as I've already put to you, photography is also the production of perspectival images. It's also the means for the construction of photogrammetry. So I'm not entirely persuaded by this notion that photography would therefore be an anti-perspectival scopic regime. Certainly it can be deployed in ways that will interfere or undermine the kind of Cartesianism that is associated with perspectivalism, this idea of rationalism and mastery and control that's supposedly associated with it. But it seems too simple a description of photography, when in many ways photography also is a further extension of perspectivalism and on the path towards the automation of perception. Jay then distinguishes a third scopic regime, The third scoping regime, he explains, is the Baroque. Dazzling, as he puts it, disorienting, an ecstatic surplus of images corresponds to the Baroque visual experience. He underlines what he calls a tactile, haptic quality. The viewer is overwhelmed with the richness of the image. Perspective is generally undermined or ignored or corrupted, all of which contributes to disrupting this Cartesian ocular centrism. Displacement of the eye as master towards, again, a more tactile, haptic kind of environment or experience. Now, if we return, having done this little detail, if we return now to Grayson and to Maudsley, what they claim is that both Cartesian perspectivalism and Baconian empiricism are implicated in the production of the drone strike. They see, on the one hand, the Cartesian perspectivalism articulated or advancing the notion of a disembodied immersion into the visual field from the perspective of an all-seeing eye, kind of mastery of the geometry, and simultaneously, in the case of Baconian empiricism, a faith in the collection and transmission of details that expose the real nature of what is being observed. And so in some ways, I think they depart perhaps from the original conception of Martin Jay. But either way, what they see in those two scopic regimes together is that they supposedly privilege access to truth. And the problem here is that is that rhetorically, ideologically, if we want, these scopic regimes serve to legitimate violence because they underpin it with a notion that what we see is reality. We can trust our visual senses. We have a form of omniscience of the battle space, and therefore our violence is, by this virtue, sanctified. So in response to this, what Grayson and Maudsley suggest is that we need to look for aesthetic ways to realize, borrowing from the work of Rancière, a redistribution of the sensible. That we need to undercut these truth claims through other forms of visual representation, through other forms of artistic representation that might disrupt the presumption of an all-seeing eye, the belief that the collection of details exposes the real nature of what we're seeing. Because of this, they critique a number of artistic projects which they think don't go far enough in breaking with the perspectival regime. For instance, they look at this is not right. Okay, not the right order. Here we go. They look at James Brittle's Dronestagram, project that receives, I think, quite a lot of attention. What Brittle did in this project is he went onto Google Earth and assembled a collection of images from sites that had been struck by drones and posted them online, a way to jar the viewer, to experience in some ways the sites of drone violence, and to do so through the format of social media and the internet through which we consume so much of our imagery. Now, what Grayson and Maudsley say of this is that the aesthetic is very similar to the abstract battle space of contemporary droning that underpins militarized representations of war fighting. It provides a disembodied and fixed view of Cartesian perspectivalism that traditionally extracts an order out of a fluctuating geopolitical environment. It also implicitly draws upon the norms of Baconian empiricism by providing a descriptive account of the visual field that is assumed to hold true regardless of the perspective of the observer. So they then articulate a similar judgment on the work of the Institute for Forensic Architecture, which they also feel is restricted to, and I cite a quote here, work within existing scopic regimes and their associated techniques in attempts to gaze upwards towards the drone. So in contrast with these kinds of artistic or para-artistic activities which they feel fall short of the kind of critique of Cartesian perspectivalism and Baconian empiricism they would like to see, they advocate what they call an immanent critique that coexists alongside an alternative way of seeing that decolonizes them. So the specific example that they discuss in the piece is, and here we go, is the work of the American Pakistani artist Mawish Chisti, who uses the figure of the drone and represents it in the visual idiom of talismanic ornaments found on trucks in Pakistan. The claim of Grayson and Maudsley is that this provincializes the drone by challenging its claim, I quote, to potential visual omniscience, to also be understood as a product of cultural presuppositions rather than universal truths. Moreover, they claim that it draws attention to the invisible, that which is not merely excluded from any regime of visibility, but constitutive of what is visible. So they valorize this artistic response at this kind of rhetorical discursive level because it undercuts in its form, in its manifestation, the classic tropes of the dominant Scopic regime. And I don't disagree with that fundamentally. But I would query whether it is enough for us in artistic practice, in general praxis, to show that there are other ways of seeing. And here perhaps the origin of Scopic regimes in cultural theory might have its inherent limitations when we attempt to widen its purchase. Jay argued in 1988 that Cartesian perspectivalism had been radically dethroned when he was writing on the basis of 20th century artistic and philosophical developments, because art had then, particularly from the modern period onwards, worked at deconstructing, at critiquing perspectival representation so thoroughly, our contemporary visual culture cannot be understood as perspectival. And of course, at the level at which the argument is pitched, that is correct. But that doesn't necessarily work when we're thinking, for example, about the modes of visual apprehension, the techniques of visualization that are embedded in contemporary military practices. In that regard, perspectivalism hasn't disappeared. Visual nominalism is as strong as it has ever been. So that critique has its limits. In fact, he notes, interestingly, Jay here again, that the Western scientific tradition may have only been made possible by Cartesian perspectivalism, suggesting that there might be a link between the absence of this Scopic regime in Eastern cultures and the general lack of indigenous scientific revolution. So he's quite clearly recognizing the link between the scientific worldview and the development of Cartesian perspectivalism. And in that sense, therefore, it has endured. And it endures not merely because it is culturally reproduced, not merely because we are still wedded to conceptions of of a God's eye or of the accuracy or the faithfulness or fidelity of our truth claims, but also because it is embedded in powerful technologies for the domination of space and people. Visual nominalism sustains itself not necessarily merely because we believe in visual nominalism, but because it's at some degree within the logistics of perception and military targeting, it works. Accordingly, I'm interested in another kind of counter-conduct, the pursuit of invisibility, a purposeful becoming imperceptible that enacts its own immanent critique of the martial gaze through a praxis that identifies and exploits their inherent biases, lacunae, and blind spots of technicized perception. I'm not inventing here anything, I'm really tapping into an important practice which I, in my book, describe as hiding. Really, the whole techniques of camouflage and dissimulation, which interestingly, if you follow its development, also has an artistic origin. Most accounts of the birth of camouflage in the early 20th century, of modern camouflage, ties it to the American painter Abbott Thayer. Thayer was very interested in the late 19th century in animal camouflage, and he conducted both scientific investigations and constructed an artistic practice around documenting and understanding the basic principles of camouflage. In particular, once he when the First World War broke out, he advocated very strongly for those techniques, many of which were, of course, pioneered in that period. He, in particular, made the important distinction, a distinction that still prevails in practices of visual camouflage today, distinctions between practices or techniques of blending and disruption. Blending is the production of disguise which seeks to blend in with the environment by using similar colors and patterns to the environment. Think about the abandonment of bright colored uniforms towards khaki and dark, dim-colored, earth-colored uniforms. Think about uniforms or that camouflage uniforms that are designed to blend in with the forest or snow or whatever environment you might find yourself in. But it also involves a technique of disruption, where, in a way, it works in an opposite way. It creates very visible contrasts which serve to, on the camouflage, which serve to break up the form. So in many ways to disrupt the visual apparatus in the ways in which we latch onto forms to recognize identifiable forms, so for example the body of a human being. These techniques of camouflage crucially work as an inverse of the logistics of perception. They are effective to the extent that they understand or that they anticipate perception. So they have to ground themselves on understanding the techniques that underlie military perception in order to disrupt it, to evade it, to perplex it. In some cases, it can take quite surprising forms, of course, as in development of dazzle camouflage, which takes disruption to the nth level. The concept of ship dazzle camouflage that was developed in the first half of the 20th century is not, of course, to make ships that you can't see. I mean, you're pretty much going to see this ship. But the difficulty is you find it very difficult to find out what direction it's traveling. What's the front, what's the back of the ship? It purposely messes with our perspectival perception and was developed initially to confound submariners that wouldn't know where to anticipate the movement of a ship and therefore interrupt and disrupt the targeting process. Now, it seems to me that this repository of techniques of concealment, of course, have become ever more sophisticated, have moved into the electromagnetic spectrum as the means of perception are extended beyond the visual field. So, of course, we might think of stealth technologies of stealth, various ways of concealing objects within or from infrared or from radar and so on. We can find, I think, artistic practices that have more to do with this conception of hiding, with this immanent technical critique, rather than the discursive critique. For instance, the work of Adam Harvey, who explicitly actually uses dazzle in his project from 2010, CV Dazzle, which is intended to produce makeup and haircuts which are designed to confound machine perception. So again, these designs can only be produced through a response, an internal critique, an investment of the technology itself in order to hack it, to break it, to confound it. Another project along the same lines that he developed was the anti-drone hijab, which is meant to conceal the infrared signature of individuals. Or again, in 2017, Hyperface, a cloth that produces or is designed to trigger facial detection within machine vision algorithms. So in principle, the algorithms will just identify a plethora of faces, which is of course tantamount to seeing no faces at all, certainly to disrupting the techniques of visual automation. So, I mean, just to sum up, my sense is what I wanted to make, the case I wanted to make today is that in order to think about the modes, the role that vision plays in contemporary military force, and the legacy of visual regimes or scopic regimes, however we want to call them, that have constructed the ways or determined the ways in which we produce images, but also how we engage in the world in violent fashions or not. It seems to me that it may not be sufficient to merely address this at the discursive rhetorical level. that can be important to raise awareness, to engage discourses at that level, to undermine the truth claims that might be embedded in forms of visual nominalism. But I would suggest that we may also need to break into these systems. We need to critique them from the internal through a mastery of their own techniques. We do not, in this sense, escape the confines of the martial gaze, but we operate within it. It doesn't offer any final victory or overcoming of them, but it posits a continuous struggle between the logistics of perception and our becomings imperceptible. Thank you.
Which I think we'll have a lot of this.
Thank you very much, Antoine. That was absolutely fascinating. And I really enjoyed the kind of historical analysis you did, in which you explained how 3 dimensions were sort of represented into 2 dimensions and things like that, which kind of made me think we're kind of moving now beyond 2-3 dimensions in terms of imagery into multiple dimensions. We have persistent-wide aerial surveillance systems which can look over vast areas, which can also record images, play back in time, possibly extrapolate forward in time. We have other factors like, as you referred to, other ways of seeing, like spectral imagery, chemical sensing, biological sensing, radiological sensing. So given that we kind of have all of these techniques now for sensing, based on lots of different platforms, you know, drones, satellites, nano drones, whatever, do you think it's ever going to be really possible in the future to remain invisible, to become invisible? Or is the kind of array of technology and techniques that are now available making that such a challenge that it won't be plausible in the future?
I mean, that's a very good question. And I think if you look at the development of the techniques of perception and the means to counter it, in some ways, the advantage seems to be very much with the seekers rather than with the hiders. Certainly if you look at it from the point of view of the high-tech means of concealment, then it looks as if it's a lot more costly to develop countermeasures. If you think, for example, about the B-2 bomber, which is the most advanced stealth aircraft the US has, these things cost $2 billion a pop. The US has never built more than 20, and they're clearly out of the reach of most states, and even for the US it's a massive outlay. So that kind of arms race, I mean, there are of course potential technological breakthroughs that we can talk about, certain metamaterials or nanotechnologies and developments within radar that could potentially shift the balance. But as it is, I agree that high-tech race probably is likely to be won, or at least to be dominated by the seekers. That said, I think one of the things that we can see if we look at the developments of the last few decades is that those who have tried to conceal themselves, who are trying to conceal themselves, and who don't have the technical means are increasingly resorting to other kinds of strategies. They're not trying to compete at a technological level, they're competing through radical strategies of concealment and dispersion. So, for instance, there's the shifting the terrain of battle to environments which are less advantageous to the means of to technical means of perception. So people don't fight wars in deserts anymore because that doesn't work. The Iraqi army tried this in 91 and it was an abject failure. You fight in the mountains, you fight in the jungles, you fight in the cities. Even more radical is the blending of combatants with civilian populations. And one of the hypothesis of my book is that this domination, this drive to visibility is actually producing a counter movement which is leading to the dissolution of anything we might think of as a contained battle space. And that adversaries are therefore adopting techniques what we might call hyper-camouflage, where they completely conceal themselves within civilian populations until they strike. And that raises huge challenges, of course, for states, but also huge problems more generally for the kinds of societies we're going to inhabit. But it strikes me that many of the means of militarized perception are likely to rebound on our own societies as the response is sought in order to counter these new forms of hypercamouflage. So that doesn't paint a particularly happy picture or one where there's any easy fixes, but it does suggest that there are always countermeasures. And the most radical countermeasure is an age-old military one, which is you don't play the game that your adversary is going to win. You change the rules of the game. The question is, are we going to like the new game that is coming towards us? And we may not.
Absolutely.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, and some very interesting things. I have two quick questions. One is based on some of my own research, looking at how militaries are starting to, or trying to visualize cyberspace and cyber warfare. And why is it that we need to visualize these things at all? What is the quest? My hunch is that the way that we interpret domains of operation and action and things, it's too much information for us to think in binary numbers or numbers, and that we need some sort of pictures and images. And then that leads me to the second part, which is, as these images are becoming more and more automated and collected beyond human agency, that we are increasingly feeling like we're being surveyed by technology itself, independent of humans. And what does a functionalism approach say about that?
Okay, a couple of big questions. I mean, there's a first point to make, of course, that the idea of visualization can maybe be a kind of misleading metaphor at some point. If we think about machine vision, those devices we've constructed that see, they don't see anything remotely like we see. I mean, they don't actually use images, properly speaking. They just have collections of data points which they analyze. And when we create visualizations, they're for us, so that we have some idea of what they're actually doing or what they might be seeing or sensing, but really they're operating at a completely different level. And whether the vision is anything but a kind of unhelpful metaphor, I think is definitely an open question from that point of view. The second question, or the second part of your question, I think is a really important one, which has to do with where does the human fit in all this? And I think there's a way in which one of the big questions that are facing us is precisely where human autonomy lies anymore. I mean, again, this could take us back to the perspectival moment, because there's an interesting kind of paradox and irony embedded in it. Most of the classical accounts of perspective will say perspective was the advent of the sovereign subject. We depict the world as it appears to humans, not to God. We're empowered, it tells us how to control the world, and all these other things. And feeds into this idea of Cartesianism and so on. But there's a sting in that tale, because at the very same time as we're doing that, we are dispossessing the human of its kind of innate capabilities, because we are creating the conditions for the autonomization, for the abstraction of perception. Moreover, when you think about the position of the subject with regard to the perspectival images, is one which fixes the viewer. As I indicated earlier on, the image can only be perfectly viewed from a single position. So I think the human actually is as much the object as the subject of perspective. And in some ways, perhaps what we've discovered since is that notion of the sovereign human subject was rather quite a fiction. And the world that we have constructed is one where that sovereignty is increasingly dubious. So one of the challenges for us is to understand how the forms of agency, where forms of agency lie. And it strikes me that increasingly in the world we live in, but particularly in military systems, agency is dispersed, is distributed. And I think, in fact, we fall prey when you talk about, we had discussions about autonomous weapon systems yesterday. I think we fall prey to certain illusions here because of this. We think of autonomous weapon systems on the model of human autonomy. But weapon systems are not any more autonomous than we are in many ways, because they are embedded in massive socio-technical chains. They don't exist because they're not without being fed data, information, logistical support, and so on. So actually, this whole idea of autonomy might be a red herring for both our sense of agency in the world and that of systems. So that doesn't provide kind of any easy answers, but I think it's important to start framing the questions in the right way, if we are at least not to get answers, but it's perhaps more insight.
Sophia.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was great. I was interested as you talk about camouflage between distinction I see between erasure and camouflage. When you think about the ways in which aerial images, especially those taken at the beginning of the 20th century, were used to kind of erase people who were dwelling in places like Iraq and maybe Palestine, and then practices like forensic architecture who kind of read those against the grain and use the actual visibility of those communities in those places to contest things like Israeli displacement of Bedouin communities in the Negev desert. So in some cases it seems that visibility is a way of resisting this kind of Scopic regime that you're providing a really compelling reading against, but I was just wondering if you could talk, because I understand this kind of camouflage to be different than, say, solely hiding, but I still think that the ways in which even drone warfare in places like crowded urban settings justifies like civilian casualties because they just couldn't see them could be another way of kind of like probing that tension.
Well, in a way, I think I'm sympathetic to the critique that we have to undermine the notion that we have a kind of omniscience or God's eye view that would legitimize our violence, and to see what is being excluded by those images. And actually, I think forensic architecture. What forensic architecture does is fantastic, and I wouldn't necessarily. I think the fact that they may use the oversight image, they may use the perspectival image, I think is not in itself a problem, or at least it's fighting with the tools of the master. I think to some extent that's what we have to do. So, I mean, I think we need kind of a multi-pronged take here. We need to both undercut kind of official accounts, bring to awareness practices that are maybe concealed rhetorically or discursively or ideologically, but we also have to master the techniques. It strikes me that actually precisely this kind of goes back to one of my original points, which was in the Renaissance there was no kind of distinction between art and science. And I think it's become increasingly clear that we will not be able to grapple with the problems in the world if we don't all strive to some extent to become technicians. We need to understand these technologies. We can no longer leave them in the hands of the people who develop them. Policymakers don't understand them, and moreover, many of the kind of technical elites who do develop them pay very little regard to the consequences of what they're doing. They're so invested in the techniques that they're working on that they don't necessarily interrogate what they're doing. And I think it falls onto us, as critical scholars, if we want to intervene in this, we cannot merely locate ourselves at the level of discourse and rhetoric. I think that's not going to be enough. We need to help to prepare the conditions for the investment of these technologies, and the first step is to try and understand them. This is probably a civilizational problem. We need to become much more technically literate. And I say this as someone who's not scientifically trained at all. So I think we tend to be deterred by these things because we don't feel confident that we have the science or the mathematics. But I think we don't necessarily need to become the masters of it. We need to just understand it. And I think that is possible, particularly in the kind of information-rich reticular culture we are. The information is out there. We can learn about it, and we can assist one another by breaking down these concepts into things that become amenable to being more widely understood, and on that basis potentially acted upon.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. My question is a little similar to the last one. I really liked what you just said about understanding the technologies, but it almost feels like hiding as the answer is a kind of a shift in perspective or a disavowal of where we are, like most of us in this room, in terms of, like, yes, we're surveilled, but we're also we're also kind of in the seat of power, right? We're in the country where people are doing this really deadly work from their relative safety, right? So I guess I'm wondering if, I don't know if I can. If hacking or infiltration or sabotage is actually a more responsible, weird to say it's responsible, but like a more given where we are, right, if that's a better framework than hiding, because hiding is a little bit of a disavowal of our own perspective and power. If that makes sense.
Well, first of all, I think your initial point is well taken. Of course, there are major asymmetries in our exposure to military perception and military targeting. Although, I think if this dissolution of the battlefield continues, that may erode to some degree. We may no longer, I think, there are asymmetries, but actually we are increasingly in a world where violence can erupt spontaneously almost anywhere. It's hyper-connected, and the violence may be state form or non-state form, and it can affect us very, very, very quickly. That's not to deny, of course, significant kind of global asymmetries that may exist, but the kind of idea of discrete zones of war in space, I think, is going to be one that's going to be increasingly difficult to hold on to. I think there's another stake, which is, we've alluded to already, which is the position of the human within these systems. And if we don't kind of acquire agency or don't assemble agency within them, we may find ourselves increasingly divested from it altogether. And to go to your point about hacking, well, I think hiding involves also hacking. So the dazzle camouflage to me is a form of hacking. What you're doing is you're deliberately disrupting the process of military perception identification on the basis of your understanding of how it works. Other forms of hacking might be, or concealment, are decoys. What you do is you draw attention to something which isn't what it seems to be. And this is where art has a great role to play. I mean, art has always been about dissimulation and about pretense and artifice. Art is about producing things that are not real in a way, right? Or creating an image that is not what it may appear to us. So I don't think, I think hiding and hacking are not necessarily this discrete categories. They participate in a kind of common endeavor to try to construct spaces and modes of resistance to perception and to power. I like the line that Deleuze gives at the end of Societies of Controls, where he says, it's not to hope or to despair, but just to build new weapons.
I mean, that just strikes a thought to me that it's not just those of us in the public who are doing this, who are hacking the system, but those in military control through the concept of strategic communications, which is the modern kind of equivalent of propaganda, really, where you try to control the perception of what is going on, and there's an awful lot of that happening at the moment. Creating within the public a kind of acceptability of control, and I think that's very interesting.
I wonder if there's another tactic, again, in the purview of those with the power, which isn't hiding but just utter exposure. So unfortunately I forget the name of the artist, but he's an activist artist who began to be surveyed because of some of his activities, and he said, you know what, forget this, I'll just put myself entirely online. So he just filmed himself, tracked himself, put all of his data out in the open, and made data analysis and interpretation that as the obstacle to the perceptual image. So in addition to kind of genealogies of camouflage, hiding, dissembling, is there another way of operating within the regime, I suppose?
Hypervisibility.
Yeah, hypervisibility.
I mean, you can also overwhelm the senses by just bombarding with sense data. Many of the techniques of, think of chaff and flares, which are meant to confuse infrared and radar sensors by just creating lots of echoes and lots of data points. And if we all shared perhaps everything, we might overwhelm the systems. That's certainly conceivable. Part of it is responding by knowing the perceptual systems, but part of it is maybe also penetrating the systems itself, and it goes to the literal sense of the understanding of hacking as computer systems as well. if war is increasingly about military perception, then the ability to interfere with that perception through one way or another, it might be through, might be the hacking of the human perceptual system, it might be the hacking of our mechanical perceptual systems. That is already an increasing site of contest between state militaries, but arguably between also the public and those systems above us.
I think last comment from,
The artist is Hassan Alahi.
Thank you.
But it brings up an interesting point too. Adam Harvey's work, something I've been very interested in, particularly the heat-seeking or the heat-blocking hijab thing. But one of the things that bugged me about that, as opposed to Hassan's work, where he's actually he's doing it. This is really kind of speculative design. Like these were never actually made and shared and actually used. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, it's fantastic. I'll get these to the people that need them. Never made that step, which bothers me on a certain level in terms of action. What's that?
There are some anti-droneware companies that are active, and you can purchase them. It's just the materials are so expensive that the people that would need them the most could never purchase them. Is the truth.
Which then goes back to Joseph's point where
Yes.
it's not really usable for those.
Oh, I thought you meant like it wasn't.
Yeah.
It's also sold for, which is also
But even if it were usable, I think what Derek made clear yesterday was that I don't think you would want to be a woman on a road in Afghanistan, invisible to the eye of the drone. There are very concrete ways in which invisibility can be a trap, as can visibility, which is what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yep.
I think unfortunately we're out of time and we need to move to the next panel, but can we please thank Antoine?